Chapter 26. The plains of Uthal formed a wide, open space of rolling grasslands. The grass was rich and green. There were few trees, although occasional knolls and low hills served to break the monotony. Some distance behind the position occupied by the Araluen army, the plains began to rise gradually to a low ridgeline. Closer to the fens, where the Wargles were forming up, a creek wound its way. Normally a mere trickle, it had been swollen by the recent spring rains so that the ground ahead of the Wargles was soft and boggy, precluding any possible attack by the Araluen heavy cavalry. Baron Fergus of Caraway shaded his eyes against the bright noon sun and peered across the plains to the entrance to Three Step Pass. "There are a lot of them," he said mildly. "And more coming," Harold of Redmont replied, easing his broadsword a little in its scabbard. The two barons were slowly walking their battle horses across the front of Duncan's drawn-up army. It was good for morale, Harold believed, for the men to see their leaders relaxed and engaging in casual conversation as they watched their enemies emerging from the narrow mountain pass and fanning out onto the plains. Dimly, they could hear the ominous, rhythmic chant of the Wargles as they jogged into position. "Damn noise is quite unnerving," Fergus muttered, and Harold nodded agreement. Seemingly casual, he cast his glance over the men behind them. The army was in position, but Battlemaster David had told them to remain at rest. Consequently, the cavalry were dismounted and the infantry and archers were sitting on the grassy slope. "No sense in wearing them out standing at attention in the sun," David had said, and the others had agreed. By the same token, he had set the various kitchen masters the task of keeping the men supplied with cool drinks and fruit. The white-clad servers moved among the army now, carrying baskets and water skins. Harold glanced down and smiled at the portly form of Master Chubb, his chef from Redmont Castle, supervising a group of hapless apprentices as they handed out apples and peaches to the men. As ever, his ladle rose and fell with alarming frequency on the heads of any apprentice he deemed to be moving too slowly. "Give that kitchen master of yours a mace and he could rout Morgarath's army single-handed," commented Fergus, and Harold smiled thoughtfully. The men around Chubb and his apprentices, distracted by the fat cook's antics, were taking no notice of the chanting from across the plains. In other areas, he could see signs of restlessness and evidence that the men were becoming increasingly ill at ease. Looking around, Harold's eye fell on an infantry captain seated with his company. Their minimal armour, plaid cloaks, and two-handed broadswords marked them as belonging to one of the northern fiefs. He beckoned the man over and leaned down from the saddle as he saluted. "Good morning, Captain," he said easily. "Morning, my lord," replied the officer, his heavy northern accent making the words almost unrecognisable. "Tell me, Captain, do you have pipers among your men?" the Baron asked, smiling. The officer answered immediately, in a very serious manner. "Aye, sir, the MacDoug and the MacFawn are with us, and always so when we go to war." "Then perhaps you might prevail upon them to give us a reel or two," the Baron suggested. "It might be an altogether more pleasant sound than that tuneless grunting from over yonder." He inclined his head towards the Wargle forces, and now a slow smile spread over the captain's face. He nodded readily. "Aye, sir, I'll see to it. There's nothing like a skirl or two on the pipes to get a man's blood prancing." Saluting hurriedly, he turned away towards his men, shouting as he ran, "MacDoug! MacFawn! Gather your wind and set to the pipes, men. Let's hear the feather-crested bonnet from ye." As the two barons rode on, they heard behind them the preliminary moaning of bagpipes coming to full volume. Fergus winced, and Harold grinned at him. "Nothing like the skirl of the pipes to get the blood prancing," he quoted. "In my case it gets the teeth grinding," replied his companion, surreptitiously nudging his horse with his heel to move them a little further away from the wild sound of the pipes. But when he looked at the men behind him, he had to agree that Harold's idea had worked. The pipes were successfully drowning out the dull chanting, and, as the two pipers marched and countermarched in front of the army, they held the attention of all the men in their immediate vicinity. "Good idea," he said to Harold, then added, "I can't help wondering if that is an equally good one." He gestured across the plain to where the walls were emerging from the pass and taking up their positions. "All my instincts say we should be hitting them up before they have a chance to form up." Harold shrugged. This point had been hotly debated by the War Council for the past few days. "If we hit them as they come out, we simply contain them," he said. "If we want to destroy Morgarath's power force once and for all, we have to let him commit his forces in the open." "And hope Holt has been successful in stopping Horth's army," Fergus said. "I'm getting a nasty crick in my neck from looking over my shoulder to make sure there's no one behind us." "Holt's never let us down before," Harold said mildly. Fergus nodded unhappily. "I know that. He's a remarkable man. But there are so many things that could have gone wrong. He could have missed Horth's army altogether. He may still be fighting his way through the thorn tree. Or worse yet, Horth may have defeated his archers and cavalry." "There's nothing we can do about it but wait," Harold pointed out. "And keep an eye to the northwest, hoping we don't see battle axes and horned helmets coming over those hills." "Now there's a comforting thought," said Harold, trying to make light of the moment. Yet he couldn't resist the temptation to turn in his saddle and peer anxiously towards the hills in the north. Iraq had waited till the last few hundred Wargals were moving down three-step pass to the plains, then forced his small group into the middle of the jogging creatures. There were a few snarls and scowls as the Scandians shoved their way into the living stream that was flowing through the narrow, twisting confines of the pass. But the heavily armed Sea Raiders snarled back and handled their double-sided battle axes with such easy familiarity that the angry Wargals soon backed off and left them alone. Evenlyn and Will were in the centre of the group, surrounded by the burly Scandians. Will's easily recognisable ranger cloak had been hidden away in one of the packs, and both he and Evenlyn wore sheepskin half-capes that were too large for them. Evenlyn's short hair was covered by a woolen cap. So far, none of the Wargals had taken any notice of them, assuming them to be servants or slaves to the small band of Sea Raiders. "Just keep your mouths shut and your eyes down," Iraq had told them as they shoved their way into the crowd of jogging Wargals. The narrow confines of the pass echoed to the tuneless chanting that the Wargals used as a cadence. The sound ebbed and flowed about them as they half ran with the stream. Iraq's plan was to move eastwards as soon as they had cleared the pass, ostensibly with the purpose of taking up a position on the right flank of the Wargal army. As soon as an opportunity presented itself, the Scandians would break off and escape into the swampy wilderness of the fenlands, travelling through the bogs and grassy islands to the beaches where Horth's fleet lay at anchor. They shuffled along, twisting and turning with the convolutions of the pass. The narrow trail led down through the sheer mountains for at least 5 kilometres, and Will could understand why it had always been a barrier to both sides. Morgarath's men couldn't move out in any large numbers unless Duncan held back and allowed them to. Similarly, the King's army couldn't penetrate the pass to attack Morgarath on the plateau. Black walls of sheer, glistening, wet rock towered above them on either side. The pass saw sunlight for less than an hour each day, right on high noon. At any other time, it was cold and damp and shrouded in shadow, all of which served to conceal the presence of the 2 younger members of the party from prying eyes. Will felt the ground beneath his feet beginning to level out and realised they must be in the last extremities of the pass, down at the level of the plains. There was no way he could even see the ground ahead of him, trapped in the seething, jostling crowd. They rounded a final bend, and a lance of sunlight stabbed into the pass, forcing him to throw up a hand to shield his eyes. They had reached the entrance, he realized. He felt a shove from his left. "Get over to the right," Irak told them, and the 4 Scandians formed a human wedge, forcing their way through the crowd until they were on the extreme right-hand side of the pass. There were growls and angry grunts from the Wargles they shoved, several of them being sent sprawling and then trampled before they could regain their feet. But the Scandians gave as good as they got in terms of threats and abuse. The sunlight hit them like a physical barrier as they emerged from the darkness of the pass, and, for a moment, Will and Evelyn hesitated. Irak shoved them on again, more anxious now as he could hear a familiar voice calling commands for the Wargles to deploy. Morgorath was here, directing operations. "Curse him," muttered Irak. "I'd hoped he'd be out with the vanguard of the army. Keep moving, you two." He shoved Will and Evelyn along a little faster. Will glanced back. Above the heads of the Wargles, he could see the tall, thin form of the Lord of Rain and Night, now clad entirely in black mail armour and surcoat, still seated on his white horse and calling instructions to the milling, chanting Wargles. Gradually, they were moving into ordered formations, then taking their position with the main army. As Will looked back, the pale face turned towards the group of hurrying Scandians, and Morgorath urged his horse towards them, unmindful of the fact he was trampling through his own men to reach them. "Captain Irak," he called. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried, thin and cutting, through the chanting of the Wargles. "Keep going," Irak ordered them in a low voice. "Keep moving." "Stop!" Now the voice was raised, and the cold anger in it instantly silenced and stilled the Wargles. As they froze in place around them, the Scandians reluctantly did the same, Irak turning to face Morgorath. The Lord of Rain and Night spurred his horse through the throng, Wargles falling back to make way for him, or being buffeted out of the way if they failed to do so. Slowly, his eyes locked on those of Irak. He dismounted. Even on foot, he towered over the bulky Scandian leader. "And where might you and your men be bound today, Captain?" he asked in a silky tone. Irak gestured to the right. "It's normal for me and my men to fight on the right wing," he said, as casually as he could manage. "But I'll go wherever you need me, if that doesn't suit." "Will you?" replied Morgorath with withering sarcasm. "Will you indeed? How terribly kind of you. You—" He broke off, his gaze on the 2 smaller figures whom the other Scandians had been trying, unsuccessfully, to shield from his gaze. "Who are they?" he demanded. Irak shrugged. "Celts," he said easily. "We took them prisoner in Celtica, and I'm planning to sell them to Orbial Ragnak as slaves." "Celtica is mine, Captain. Slaves from Celtica are mine as well. They're not for you to take and sell to your barbarian of a king." The Scandians surrounding Will and Evelyn stirred angrily at his words. Morgorath turned his cold eyes on them, then looked away at the thousands of Wargles who surrounded them, every one ready to obey any command of his without question. The message was clear. Irak tried to bluff his way through the situation. "Our agreement was we fought for booty, and that includes slaves," he insisted, but Morgorath cut him off. "If you fought," he shouted furiously. "If! Not if you stood by and let my bridge be destroyed." "It was your man Chirath who was in command at the bridge," Eric flashed back at him. "It was he who decided no guard was to be left on it, and we were the ones who tried to save it while he was hiding behind rocks." Morgorath's gaze locked with Irak's once more, and now his voice dropped to a low, almost inaudible level. "I am not spoken to in that fashion, Captain Irak," he spat. "You will apologize to me at once, and then—" He stopped in mid-sentence. He seemed to possess almost unnatural peripheral senses. Although he had been staring unblinkingly into Irak's eyes, he had apparently sensed something off to one side. Those black eyes now turned and trained on Will. One white, bony finger was raised, pointing at the boy's throat. "What is that?" Irak looked and felt a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. There was a dull gleam of bronze visible in the gap of Will's open collar. Then Irak felt himself shoved to one side as Morgorath moved, snake fast, and snatched at the chain around Will's neck. Will staggered back, horrified at the implacable fury in those dead eyes and the slight flare of colour above the cheekbones. Beside him, he heard Evelyn's intake of breath as Morgorath stared down at the small bronze oak leaf in his hand. "A ranger!" he raged. "This is a ranger! This is their sign." "He's a boy," Irak began, but now Morgorath's fury was turned upon him, and he swept his hand in a backhanded blow across the Scandian's cheek. "He is no boy, he is a ranger." The other 3 Scandians moved forward at the blow, weapons ready. Morgorath didn't even have to speak. He turned those glittering eyes on them, and 20 Wargles moved as well, a warning growl in their throats, clubs and iron spears ready. Irak signalled for his men to settle. The red mark of Morgorath's blow flared on his cheek. "You knew," Morgorath accused him. "You knew." Then realization dawned on him. "This is the one. Arrows, you said. My Wargles were hiding from arrows as the bridge burnt. Ranger weapons. This is the swine who destroyed my bridge." The voice rose to a shriek of fury as he spoke. Will's throat was dry and his heart pounded with terror. He knew of Morgorath's legendary hatred for rangers. All members of the Corps did. Ironically, it was Holt himself who had triggered that hatred when he led the surprise attack on Morgorath's army at Hackham Heath 16 years previously. Irak stood before the raging Black Lord and said nothing. Will felt a small, warm hand creep into his. Evelyn. For a moment, he marvelled at the girl's courage. To bond herself to him like this, in the face of Morgorath's implacable fury and hatred. Then another horse forced its way through the crowd. On its back was one of Morgorath's Wargle lieutenants, one of those who had learned basic human speech. "My lord," he called, in the peculiar, emotionless tones of all Wargles, "enemy advancing." Morgorath swung to face him, and the Wargle continued, "Their skirmish line moving towards us, my lord. Battle is beginning." The Lord of Rain and Night came to a decision. He swung back into the saddle of his horse, his furious gaze now locked on Will, not Irak. "We'll finish this later," he said. He turned to a Wargle sergeant among those who had surrounded the Scandians. "Hold these prisoners here until I return, on pain of your life." The Wargle saluted, one fist to his left breast, then growled a command to his men. They surrounded the Scandian party. The 4 sea-wolves now formed a small circle facing out, Will and Evelyn in the middle. They held their weapons ready. It was a standoff, and they were obviously prepared to sell their lives dearly. "We'll settle this later, Irak," Morgorath said. "Try to escape, and my men will cut you to pieces." And, wheeling his horse, he galloped through the throng once again, scattering soldiers in his path, trampling those who were too slow to move. They heard the thin, nasal voice calling commands to his forces as he disappeared.